So I'm delighted to be here with you talking about this very important topic of karma and sanskaras, which may sound a little dry on the surface, but hopefully by the end of it, that the relevance of this and the personal relevance of this topic will, if it's not already apparent to you, will become even more apparent. I was trying to think what I wanted to say about opening tonight. I woke up this morning very early and I was thinking, we really live in a time when these concepts and even the language of karma and sanskaras is really kind of ubiquitous. And I was thinking, just today, this is just from my experience today, and I have to admit, I watched a Western on TV this afternoon just to relax a little bit. And there was like good guys and bad guys. And the bad guy did something bad to the good guy. And the good guy said, "Oh, you're going to get karma for that." That's how ubiquitous this is in the language, but that wasn't true, that wasn't true, back in the John Wayne days and, going way back when. And then I was thinking about the concept of sanskaras, and I also was reading the paper today. There's a new movie that's just come out called Inside Out 2. Some of you may have seen Inside Out 1. And I was reading about it, and it's all about this little girl and her interior life and all of the different voices inside of her of anger and jealousy and hope and et cetera, et cetera. And that's really all sanskaras. That's all sanskaric reality, that whole movie is about nothing but that. And I was thinking, this was not true when Mayor Baba was born. It was not true when he began his advent. Baba started teaching about these concepts of sanskaras very, very early on in the 1920s, and then went on to develop them and gave these beautiful discourses about them that we'll be drawing from tonight in tonight's program. But I was thinking it's easy to speculate that when the avatar comes, he comes to bring about a universal transformation of consciousness. And this is an awareness that's gotten woven into our society in the time of Baba's life, and certainly, and then since he physically passed. And so one can easily speculate that this is part of the outgrowth of the transformation of consciousness that Mayor Baba came to give. This is, when we talk about sanskaras, I just want to give you this short quote to begin with, because, again, sanskaras, it's kind of an odd term. It's not widely used, but Baba actually said that the concept of sanskaras is the foundation for all of his teachings. So what we're talking about tonight is really elemental. It's really very, very fundamental. So I'm going to be sharing with you tonight about this. I want to say at the outset, as I always say, I'm not coming to you as an academic it's not like I've scoured all of the different, theological and spiritual texts about this concept. I'm synthesizing what I've learned from Baba. I'm not coming to you as a cosmologist, as a theoretician. I'm simply coming to you as just another fellow Baba lover who has been absorbing these concepts and trying to sort of make sense out of them and connect dots between them as best I can. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you. These are some of the topics we're going to cover here tonight about what's karma and sanskaras and the relationship between karma. Like what's the relationship between karma and sanskaras and ego? Because that's a fundamental concept. And then how do we use this understanding of karma and sanskaras in our own spiritual development and relationship with Baba? And that gets into the whole business of what Baba called unwinding sanskaras, kind of helping to lessen their grip on us. I'm going to also talk a little bit about psychology and healing as it relates to sanskaras, because I would suggest to you or propose to you that the whole awareness of psychology, and we do live in a psychological age, is fundamentally about sanskaras. And so what is the relationship? What did Baba say about psychology? And I'm going to give you my own thoughts about healing and therapy as it relates to sanskaras. And finally, and really in my mind, most important, what's the role of the master, specifically Mayor Baba, but it could be any perfected being, in terms of helping in this process of unwinding of sanskaras. I've got quite a bit to share with you tonight, And it is a whole presentation. And I know that there could be lots of comments and lots of questions as we go through it. And I'm going to ask that you actually hold those till the end. And so I can get through it, because again, I'm trying to keep a thread going here. So if you would indulge me on that, I would really appreciate that. So I'm also going to be sharing quite a bit of Baba's own words that come largely out of the discourses, but also a book called The Path of Love, and there's some other sources that I drew from for this presentation. I think it's very helpful and important to read Baba's words about this. Baba did say to Don Stevens, as we know, that there was a spiritual power that he put into each of these words, and that there was a benefit spiritually to actually reading the words themselves as opposed to just hearing the concepts. So I'm going to be talking about it, but also giving you a fair amount of what Baba said. So let me go back a couple slides here and say, I reflected in my own life about this concept of karma. And, I was born in a particular family. I had a very particular set of parents with very particular attributes and personalities, siblings. I was born into and grew up in a cultural context, socioeconomic context that was very specific to me. And that context, as I think about it, has been very important for me in working on my own patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. And it's been it has felt to me, and Baba Baba's words would assure me that it was very specifically tailored for me to work on these attributes of myself. So this notion of karma is in fact very, very, very central to kind of our own unique situations. So I want to start really at the very, very beginning of this, and I'm going to do this very quickly. I did a presentation several weeks ago called Journey of the Soul. It's on the center website if you missed it and are interested. It goes into depth about what this chart's all about. It comes from Baba's magnum opus, God Speaks, which is his explanation about the purpose and the structure and process of creation. And this is, and I just want to put sanskaras in the context of what Baba said about his cosmology. He said basically the whole journey of the soul is a journey from God unconscious here in the beyond state through a whole process of developing, evolving consciousness and then involving consciousness to get back to conscious realization of self as infinite consciousness or God. And he said that happens through three basic phases. The first one is the evolution of consciousness through form, which is where consciousness starts with we all started, I hate to tell you this, but we all started in sub-gaseous forms. I know I didn't mean to shock you, but that's sort of what Baba tells us. And then evolved, as our consciousness developed, the forms were given to us that were appropriate to our different states of consciousness to evolve through those forms. So it got more and more complete and full until finally we got to the human form when Baba said, actually, consciousness is complete. But in fact, we don't experience consciousness as complete because we've got a residue of what Baba calls sanskaras, which are mental impressions that we've gained from our journey up to that point in time. And Baba says we have a tremendous journey still ahead of us to unwind those sanskaras. And also, in that process, we're also creating new sanskaras that also have to be unwound. So that's a very long process. Baba said it's 8,400,000 lifetimes in that form to be able to go through that whole process till one is ready to refine one's consciousness sufficiently that we are ready then to transcend the gross world and start moving into the higher worlds of the subtle planes and the mental planes, which is the process Baba calls involution of consciousness. And that is what eventually prepares us for the final ascent to God realization. And what is common throughout all of this is the acquisition of and then eventually the wearing out of sanskaras that eventually allows us to achieve that. So that's a very quick walkthrough what Baba said about this whole process. And again, there's so much more to be said about it, and the book God Speaks is really the prime source to go to for that. But I want to start out by exploring this by exploring what Baba said about karma, because in the end, Baba said it's the balancing out of karma that is the condition for us to move forward in our own journey in consciousness. And much is talked about, and we've said that, but about karma these days, as we think of it as, oh, well, you got, what goes around comes around. It's sort of like the vernacular about that. But Baba actually calls this notion of karma, he calls it the rigid law of causation. It's the law of cause and effect, which prescribes that everything we do, for everything we do, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Now, this kind of makes sense because we live in a world of duality, of opposites, of good, bad, male, female, east, west, rich, poor, high, low, all of the different myriad, almost infinite numbers of kinds of opposites that we're confronted with, within which we gain a false identification of who we really are. And this actually is the very field for us to both wind sanskaras, but it's actually the field for us to actually come to terms with these sanskaras and begin unwinding them. So here's what Baba says about karma. And I want to read these words to you because they're very beautiful. He says, the successive incarnations with all their particulars are closely and unfailingly determined by rational law, so that it becomes possible for the individual soul to mold its future through wise and intelligent action. The actions of past lives determine the conditions and circumstances of the present life, and the actions of the present life have their share in determining the conditions and circumstances of future lives. Successive incarnations of the individual soul yield their full significance only in the light of the operation of the law of karma. Now, Baba's sister Mani, this is a photograph of Baba's very close woman, Mandali, and sister Mani. She used to say to us, be careful what you pack in your suitcase, because what you do in this life, you will be unpacking from your suitcase in your next life. So she's highlighting that karma, that Baba's really highlighting for us, I believe, that karma is essential for us in learning to shape our actions to be wise and intelligent. And karma can't just be understood in the context of our current life and circumstances. And the working of karma can only be understood through looking at the pattern across successive lives when karma that's earned in one life shows up in a subsequent life. Where am I? There we are. So Baba then goes on to explain how karma actually plays out in our own being, in our own body. And Baba, this is a picture of kind of the anatomy of the soul that Baba gave us. That the soul is Atma. That's a word that Baba would use for soul. And that essentially the soul has a mind around it, and that the sanskaras are contained within the mind. And all of that is infused into the mental body. And so we all have these three bodies. We all have a mental body, a subtle body, and a gross body until we transcend all of that into the God state. So this is the anatomy that Baba gave us about this. So here's what Baba says. He says, karma persists as a connecting link and determining factor through the mental body, which remains a permanent and constant factor through all the lives of the soul. The law of karma and its manner of operation cannot be fully intelligible as long as the gross body and the gross world are considered to be the only facts of existence. Karmic determination is made possible by the existence of the subtle and mental bodies and worlds. Now, Baba then goes on to explain that what we might seem to experience as our own free will, our own freedom of action, is actually completely circumscribed by the karma we bring into this life, into our lives. And Baba calls this imperative, his term for it, which I think is such a wonderful term, he calls it the inexorable must. That's M-U-S-T, not M-A-S-T, for those of you who are aware of Baba's work with musts. This is what he says, and I'm going to read quite a bit of this because I think this is so fundamental to understanding karma. Everything and everyone in the universe is constrained to move along a path which is prescribed by its past. There is an inexorable must that reigns over all things, large or small. Whether one is male or female, rich or poor, strong or weak, beautiful or ugly, intelligent or dull, one cannot escape from being such because one must necessarily be so due to the impressions of the past. The freedom which man seems to enjoy is itself subject to inner compulsions, and the environmental pressure which limits the scope of reactions or molds the reacting self is itself subject to the inexorable must, which is operative in the past, present, and future. You know, there's so many conversations that you hear, that I've heard anyway, about what did Baba say about free will? And I know there's a lot of opinions about that, but my understanding is Baba said that there was no free will. He said, not a leaf falls from a tree except by my will. He said, everything is karmically determined. So again, this is what Baba's trying to, I think, explore in the statement here. He says, man has his name, his sex, his personality, his color, his nationality, his characteristics, his pain and pleasure, and all that he may possess, because he must have all these. That's the must in there. This overpowering compulsion is exercised by the force of innumerable impressions gathered in the past. These accumulated impressions cloud the consciousness of the self at every state, in every incarnation of the future, which in one's life belongs to one's living present. The rule of this inexorable must governs and reshapes the so-called destiny of man in every incarnation as long as the self of man remains conscious of impressions. Impressions, again, is another word for sanskaras that Baba uses. The principle of must, which overrides human plans, is based on divine law, which both adjusts and gets adjusted by evolutionary impressions. It's only the divine will that can supersede the divine law. So another way of saying this, that Baba's explained how the karma of an individual basically determines the conditions for its incarnation, or a more common way that we could put it is the cards we've been dealt is what that is. So again, back to Baba's words, the general aids and handicaps of an incarnation are always determined by the specific sanskaras which the individual soul has accumulated in the past. The needs involved in the further development of the soul are related to the nature of its accumulated sanskaras. Therefore, these accumulated sanskaras really determine whether the soul takes its incarnation on the earth in the east or in the west, in the male form or the female form, or in one cycle of existence or another. The facilities afforded by a specific incarnation are dependent not only upon whether an incarnation is in the male form or female form, but also upon whether it takes place in one cycle of existence or another cycle of existence, and whether it matches the tenor of earthly life in the Eastern Hemisphere or in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Baba has said, and this is really more from Listen to Humanity, where a lot of this is discussed. He said specifically that with very few exceptions, we're born into families where we do have a strong karmic connection with at least one person in the family, and it is usually the parent. Now, there are cases, and Baba said, for example, in times of war, where there's a rapid turnover of souls due to death and so on, and they need to find places for individuals to incarnate again. that they cannot always, it will not always be a close karmic connection with the parent. It may be with the sibling, and even in some cases, it may not have any. I meet people from time to time and say, I don't feel any karmic connection with anyone in my family. Whether that's true or not, I don't know how you would know that, other than there's just not a sense of strong connection. But Baba also makes it clear that there are occasionally rare exceptions to the law of karma. And these are in cases where a perfected being, such as a perfect master, but there are other perfect beings, has dipped into what theosophists would refer to as the Akashic records. I don't know if some of you may have heard that term. It gets used from time to time, which is the record and some plane of existence of everything that has ever happened from the beginningless beginning to the endless end. Everything that has happened, is happening, and will ever happen. And that a perfect being can dip into those records and make a change in somebody's karmic condition. But I want to say, it's not a small thing for somebody to do that. Because as you can imagine, once you make one little change for one person, that has ramifications for all of the direct relationships that person has with other people, as well as all the indirect relationships all the way to the very end. So there's a lot of adjusting that's got to be done when that happens. Now, one of the better known examples of where this has happened was with one of Baba's mandali named Harry Kenmore. He was a blind chiropractor, and he was very close with Baba. He came to Baba after Baba's second accident outside Satara in India, probably in 1957, I think is when he went there. And he treated Baba because Baba had very serious injuries from that accident. So he treated him and was really instrumental in helping Baba to regain the ability to walk again. And Harry Kenmore was an extremely unusual man. And Baba called him Mandali. He's buried with the other men Mandali in Lower Mehrabad. Harry's a person of very unusual spiritual insight, who had the capacity apparently to actually read the Akashic records. And he went into the Akashic records to find out, why was I blind? Because being blind was a real handicap for him. Why was I blind? And he said he couldn't find anything in the Akashic records karmically that would explain why he was blind in this particular lifetime. And he went to Baba and said that. And Baba said to him, you're right. It's true. I had to alter that part of your karma in order to make it essential for you to come to me. Because had I not done that, you would have been a world-class doctor, surgeon, and would never have come into my orbit. And so I had to do that for that purpose. So it's probably this modification of people's karma is done extremely rarely. Now, one could say, well, it's because the perfect masters don't want the workload of it. But I don't think that that's the reason, because they're really capable of an infinite amount of work. But I think it really has to do with the fact that karma is benevolent. That the karma we have is the karma we need in order to progress. And so rather than seeing it as sort of a curse, karma is actually a gift to us that gives us the conditions and circumstances to work through the very things that are most essential for us to work through. And that's essentially why the perfect ones do not mess with people's karma. Now, if karma is the law of creation, then the question is, how does it function? And the answer to me seems to be, it functions through sanskaras. Now, to understand sanskaras, which are the impressions of the mind, which constitute the very force that impels us to our thinking, our feeling, and our actions. And to understand them, I'm going to quote from one of Baba's discourses on the formation and function of sanskaras. And he starts by clarifying the relationship between our objective experience, which, as we've already seen, is largely a function of our karma, and the subjective aspect of our experience, which is a function of our sanskaras. So Baba says, there are two aspects of human experience, the subjective and the objective. On the one hand, there are mental processes that constitute essential ingredients of human experience, and on the other hand, there are things and objects to which they refer. The mental processes are partly dependent upon the immediately given objective situation, which is we've just heard, is largely a result of our karma, or entirely a result of our karma, it's probably more accurate, and partly dependent upon the functioning of accumulated sanskaras, or impressions of previous experiences. The human thus finds itself between a sea of past sanskaras on the one side and the whole extensive objective world on the other. Now, Baba then goes on to clarify exactly what are the sanskaras and impressions. Human actions are based upon the operation of the impressions stored in the mind through previous experience. Every thought, emotion, and act is grounded in groups of impressions that, when considered objectively, are seen to be modifications of the mind. These impressions are deposits of previous experiences and become the most important factors in determining the course of present and future experience. The mind is constantly creating and gathering such impressions in the course of its experience. I mean, Baba says even breathing creates sanskaras, like everything creates sanskaras. The problem of understanding the significance of human experience, therefore, turns around the problem of understanding the formation and function of sanskaras. I don't know how more fundamental you can get than that one statement, that sanskaras are really the bottom line about understanding our own human experience. So in essence, what Bob is saying is sanskaras are the conditioning of the mind that motivates thoughts, feelings, words, and actions. And if these thoughts, words, feelings, and actions are based on a false understanding of who we are, and Baba said that is going to be our reality up to the point that we are fully God realized. If it's based on a false understanding of who we are, then these sanskaras essentially constitute the veil between ourselves and God. That's essentially what sanskaras are the veil that keeps us from seeing God. And I remember that metaphor that Baba used of the umbrella. He said the sun's shining on us, and we're standing right there. The sun's right there. He said even something as seemingly insignificant as an umbrella keeps us from experiencing the sun. And that's when he talked about the umbrella that way. He was talking about our sanskaras, is what that refers to. Now, when we do anything, including thinking, talking, or acting, we accumulate residue from that in the form of mental impressions that reside in the mind or mental body. And these propel us to continue to think or act in a certain way. So if we do greedy things, like we steal something from somebody, we get greedy sanskaras, which actually feed those greedy tendencies. We become more greedy. So there's a kind of deepening of ourselves. It's like a deepening of the rut, or we're deepening ourselves of the tendency when we put this action. It's like digging ourselves deeper into the hole in which we're stuck. But here's where karma comes to our rescue. Because at the same time, we inherit the karma, which is the result of our actions. And karma, again, is the rigid law of causation that says for each action, there's kind of like a boomerang effect. For example, I'm unkind to somebody by criticizing them. And I get some sanskaras from that that feed my judgmental nature. But then I also inherit the karma of that, which means I'm going to have to confront a situation where I'm the recipient of that kind of criticism, that kind of judgment. And that gives me the opportunity to work through and release and unwind those sanskaras that I've inherited by having done the greedy action. And that's kind of the relationship between karma and sanskaras. They're highly interdependent phenomena here. So and on the basis of all of that, there is a kind of a learning and assimilation that can occur. So the karma we inherit actually gives us the very context we need for working through our sanskaras. And in that sense, karma is really a gift, even though it often doesn't feel like one. It's not packaged like one, and it can feel like a curse. But really speaking, if you step back far enough from ourselves and get really being objective about it, it really is a gift. And Baba says that the learning that we get from that gets stored in the mental body in the realm that we call intuition. And that intuition, which Baba said develops over many, many, many lifetimes, eventually becomes a source of inner wisdom that we can tap into. And of course, Baba said that his manifestation in this avataric advent would be to open up the age of intuition, where intuition and access to it becomes widespread. So it is a mistake to look on sanskars as inherently bad, just as karma shouldn't be looked on as inherently bad. It's true, sanskars ultimately form a barrier that needs to be overcome, but it also plays a crucial role in gaining and assimilating experience and growing spiritually. So when we talk about samskaras, it can seem like they're things, but where do they actually reside? So here's what Baba had to say about that. The plane on which one can possess physical consciousness is the gross world. The planes on which one can possess consciousness of desires are in the subtle world. That's in the first three planes of consciousness are the subtle, and the fourth plane is transitional. And the planes on which the soul can have mental consciousness are in the mental world. That's planes 5 and 6. The mind retains all impressions and dispositions in a latent form. The limited I or ego is composed of these sanskaras. Again, we're starting to kind of link the concept of ego to sanskaras here. The limited I or ego is composed of these sanskaras. However, the actual manifestation of sanskaras in consciousness, as expressed through different mental processes, takes place in the subtle body. Then Baba says, the ego mind is formed by the accumulated impressions of past experiences and actions, and it is this ego mind that constitutes the kernel of the existence of the reincarnating individual. The ego mind, as a reservoir of latent impressions, is the state of the mental body. The ego mind becoming spirit and experiencing activated and manifested impressions is the state of the subtle body. The ego mind, as descended in the gross sphere for creative action, is the state of a physical incarnation. So the sanskaras go from the mental mind, from the mental sphere into the subtle sphere, where they're activated and energized into the gross sphere in which they're acted out or experienced. Thus, the ego mind, which is seated in the mental body, is the entity that contains all the phases of continued existence as a separate individual. So the problem of the ego is essentially the problem of sanskaras. And to the extent that the ego is what we need to overcome in order for us to advance spiritually, it comes down to the problem of dealing with our sanskaric load. And the dealing with this simply can't be avoided. And it actually gets more complicated over time as we accrue more and more sanskaras, especially when we get into the human form. We've gotten through the evolution of other forms, and the human form, we're starting to accrue even more sanskaras. And Baba actually refers to those sanskaras as unnatural sanskaras, as opposed to the natural sanskaras that we accrue during evolution through form. Now, all of this can come to seem like the deck is stacked against us if we get in the human form and we have all these sanskaras, but we start accumulating more and more sanskaras. It can feel like we're doomed to keep adding more and more sanskaras or impressions to our burden. Now, Martin Luther King said something. He said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So this seems to be also true as it relates to one's own karma. So something similar might be said to say about our karma, that the arc of our karma is long, but it bends toward realization. Bob has also suggested that we live in a creation that is inherently benevolent. This means it's designed to move us in the direction of freedom and ultimate realization of who we really are, and that the justice that karma exacts is actually there for our own learning and growth. So the circumstances we face are not simply about reward and punishment. They're in fact the very conditions that are best suited to enable us to work out our karma through the playing out of our sanskar patterns. Baba says, the circumstances of each incarnation are adjusted to the composition and needs of the ego mind. Just as the nature of karma in earthly life is determined by impressions stored in the ego mind, the impressions in turn are determined by the nature of karma in earthly life. The impressions in the ego mind and the nature of karma are interdependent. Karma on earth plays an important part in shaping and reshaping the impressions in the ego mind and giving it a momentum that decides the further destiny of the individual. It is in the arena of earthly existence that creative and effective karma can be expressed through the medium of the gross body. Proper understanding and use of the law of karma enables man to become master of his own destiny through intelligent and wise action. Each person has become what he is, and Baba used, by the way, the male pronoun here. That was the times that he was in. So I just kind of give you, some of you may need a trigger warning about such things. Each person has come what he is through his own accumulated actions, and it is through his own actions that he can mold himself according to the pattern of his heart, or finally emancipating himself from the reign of karmic determination which governs him through life and death. So again, Baba's indicated the way karma works, the circumstances of our birth and lives are really there to facilitate working through our karmic debts through our sanskaras. Now, let's talk about how that happens. So we now understand the determining role that our karma and sanskaras play in consciousness. We get to the question that this talk is really all about, which is, given the circumstances created by our karma and the compulsion of our sanskaras, how do we actually use this understanding to help us to progress spiritually? And Baba let us know that the requirement for advancing toward the goal of self-realization is actually not to amass a lot of good impressions or good sanskaras. That's not the goal of all of this. But actually, it's to balance out all impressions. For it is when all impressions are in exact balance with one another that one is ready to achieve and fulfill their intention to fully disidentify from their false self, and then which then leads to recognition of who they really are, who we really are. And at the moment of complete balance, one then does enter into the realization of self on the seventh plane of consciousness. Now, Baba actually illustrated this in one of the discourses. And I'm not going to give you the full story about this. It's a more involved story, and I don't want to actually take the time to tell the whole story about it. But it is a story about a man who murdered 99 people. And he became very repentant about this. He realized it wasn't a good thing to do that. So he eventually sought out the guidance and help from a perfect master. And the perfect master told him he had to go into a forest and meditate and do penance and all that. And while he was there in the forest, there was a group of people who were sent by a king, and that they disrupted him in the middle of his meditation, brought him out of it, and made him very angry. And so the murderer, because he couldn't control his anger, actually killed the man who was leading that little retinue. And it turned out that the man leading this retinue was actually making their way to another village to give an order that there were 100 innocent people that had to be killed. And so by killing this one man, it balanced out all of the 99 lives of the innocent people who he had saved. And Baba said when that happened, he got realization. Now, I don't know, and I don't know it's presented that this is a factual story. I think it's really more of a metaphor that Baba uses to illustrate that really the whole game is about balancing karma. It's not about getting better. So while one can acquire good impressions from doing good deeds, it's also necessary to experience the opposite, which is the experience of, one of them is the experience of receiving the benefit of good deeds, but it's also the experience of doing bad deeds. That we have to have both kinds of experiences in this world in order for us to progress. Now, I've heard the question come up many times with the mandala. Well, let me say this: if one has done something bad, like murder someone, you have to experience being murdered in response to that. But it doesn't necessarily occur within the same lifetime. In fact, I've even read where it says it won't occur in the same life. It'll be in a future lifetime that will happen. It's kind of in keeping with Mani's quote about that. But I've heard the question raised many times, and it may have come up for you. I know I was in with the Mandali about how do we come to terms with what seems like such a massive injustice like the Holocaust. And God knows there's so many going on today. Gaza, Ukraine, you can just keep going down the list. But how do we come to terms with that kind of injustice of these incredible, these innocent people being rounded up and tortured and gassed and so on? And the answer, and I know I raised this question when I first went to India in 1972, and the answer has been, and always with great compassion that I felt from the Mandali, but the answer has been that these souls must be repaying karmic debts from prior lifetimes. Now that can sound very glib, and when I've talked to Mandali about it, I talked to Arnavas about that very directly, and I can assure you there was nothing glib or simplistic about that response. It was simply a statement of, this is really what Baba says. It's that what we experience, we are reaping what we have sowed in some previous life. And it may sound like blaming the victim and so on, but again, karmic law is the rigid law of cause and effect. If you do something in one life, there will have to be some kind of payback in another life. So that is how that was addressed. The other thing I want to say is it doesn't actually, the impact of the karma that we inherit from doing these things doesn't seem to be so much about the action itself, but it's about the underlying motivation that is behind the action, that actually creates either freedom or binding. For example, Bob said, any service given to others, a seemingly indisputably good thing to do, is a boon to the person or not, depending on whether the motivation is somehow to fluff up one's own sense of reputation or sense of importance, so they get seen as doing good things, or whether it's done out of purely selfless motives, out of an underlying sense of unity with the person they're helping, and a detachment from the results. Now, I was once in Mandali Hall in Marizad. This is where Baba lived from 1944 till the end of his physical life in 1969. And we would those of us who would go to India during that period would go to Marizad and visit with the Mandali who were there. And Erich Jesawala was one of Baba's very closest men Mandali in his life. And so I was sitting there with Erich one day, and somebody came in there into the hall, and they said to Erich, is it a good thing to do social work? Is social work a good thing to do? And Erich's response was very interesting. He said, social work is a very good thing to do as long as you do it for yourself. And actually, that's exactly what Baba says in the discourse on selfless service. And what he meant by that, he said, it's so counterintuitive, but it's in keeping with what Baba said, that anytime we do anything for another person, we can do it in such a way that we actually very subtly create a sense of obligation from that person. Like somehow, you owe me something. I am owed something for doing this. Or do we do it? And Baba said the remedy to that is anytime we do something selfless, to reverse the thought process and say, I'm actually being obligated by the opportunity to serve you because I'm serving myself in you. And he said that's a way of weakening any kind of sanskaric residue that comes from that interaction. And Baba did say also, and I think this is so important, he said, there was nothing so beneficial spiritually as helping other people. He said it was more beneficial than all the prayers and meditating and penance and solitude, anything else. He said the most beneficial thing we can do is to help one another. So Jeff Wolverton, who many of you know, he works here on the center, and if you haven't met him, you probably will. He's around. But he told me about a time he was in India in one of his very early trips, and he was talking with Eric Jessawala, and he was trying to work out in his own mind the question of how could he concentrate more on doing good things in his life and avoid doing bad things. I mean, again, he was young. It was early days and all that. But Eric's response is such a wonderful response. He said, Jeff, you need to understand that the accumulation of virtues is not the goal. And rather, that Jeff got this vision that showed him that the real object is to get off the train of opposites as soon as he can. All of this also reminds me of this version of the Rumi poem that was done by Coleman Barks and John Moynes, this is just 2 lines from the poem. It's a beautiful poem if you don't know it. It says, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. So, in other words, simply by adding more and more good deeds to one side of the scales of our karma will not ultimately lead us to freedom, but freedom really comes from balancing. So if the goal is to awaken, and if it takes bad things happening to balance out karma in order to wake up, then we have to experience that. On the other hand, it also might be presumed that as a result of the accumulated sanskaras that we've gotten over the many, many lifetimes in evolution through form and in our human form, that we probably, there's probably a point where we've probably accumulated more, quote, negative sanskaras and karma than positive sanskaras, given all the imperatives of survival and territory and opportunities for procreation and so on that are attendant upon all of these different kinds of lives. And that in the human form, it's understandable, at least, that for the general population, avatars do tend to emphasize the value of doing good things. I know I did an interview last year with a man named Rick Archer, who has a program called Buddha at the Gas Pump. And in it, he said, his way of putting it was, it's easier to escape from a prison of good than it is to escape from a prison of bad. So I thought that was a nice way of putting it. But Zoroaster, the great avatar, who's the first of the lineage of avatars in our known history, did emphasize as his core precepts good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. But especially as one gets closer and closer to the start of the spiritual path, the emphasis is probably more on the detachment from all thoughts, words, and deeds that becomes actually primary in terms of our own advancement. So Bob has compared the situation we're in with, it's like our sanskaras are like a giant ball of string that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill. And because more sanskaras keep being added all the time, until finally we get to the point where we recognize these sanskaras are weighing heavily on us and actually are keeping us from having the kind of higher experience of who we really are that we long for. So Baba uses a term that seems to refer to this kind of awakening as he calls this, that we're driven by the logic of experience, that we've exhausted many of the possibilities of learning from looking outwardly and trying to further our own sense of fulfillment through the perpetuation of our own egoic life. And we get a glimmer that our true learning, our true growth in consciousness is not through continuing to play out all of our various dramas, to play out all the possibilities from that outward facing, but that has consumed us over countless lifetimes. But at this point, we're ready to begin to look within for our own growth in consciousness. And at this point, what Baba refers to as the drop soul, that's the individual, can be said to make what might be the last major turning and preparing ourselves to enter into the spiritual path that will lead to involution and finally realization. But this is also probably not immediate. it takes place over multiple lifetimes as we begin to accept that the outer world is not going to be the source of fulfillment that we had heretofore hoped, and that therefore the fulfillments that we get externally tend to be transitory and illusory. And at this point, we are ready to seek that which is not transitory, that which is not ultimately illusory, of what could be called the truth. So the game is coming to its conclusion. And the drop soul can perhaps be termed at this point an aspirant for the truth, or what Baba will call a jivatma. But the aspirant at this point faces a fundamental challenge. He or she wants to move in this direction, but is facing the complications of an accumulation of sanskaras, which continue to propel them forward toward these pursuits that are not ultimately going to free them to pursue the heights they're longing for. So the dilemma that the drop soul faces then is how to resolve these remaining sanskaras, which are starting to get less dense because they're not being accumulated in the same velocity, and they're starting to be less determinative over the person's lives. Now, in his discourses, Baba actually offers several solutions to this dilemma, and he called this phase in the process the unwinding of sanskaras. If you go back to Rano's chart, you'll see that all the way through up to the point of involution, you see this winding process. But now we're starting to do the unwinding of sanskaras. And Baba says these are the primary methods for unwinding sanskaras. And you can find more on this in Baba's discourses. He holds discourses about this. And very simply, avoid creating new sanskaras. Inaction actually can be a spiritual path. It's not one that Baba generally recommended for this time period, but it actually can be a spiritual path. Wearing out old sanskaras by withholding them, by expressing them in action. This is self-control that Baba's talking about there. Unwinding past sanskaras, simply going against them. In fact, there is a whole there's a whole spiritual path about neti, not this, that is all about, just pushing back against the sanskaras. Sublimation, finding other channels for expressing them that are not so binding. And the last one, which we're going to spend time on, is the wiping out of sanskaras, which can be affected by the grace of a perfect master. Baba goes on to talk about some different practices that are associated with these: renunciation, solitude and fasting, penance, denying desires, meditation, and selfless service. I'd say of all of these, quite frankly, in general for his lovers and for general population, at this point in time, I'd say Baba probably placed the most emphasis back here on selfless service as the primary method for unwinding sanskaras for those of us who are alive today in the Avatar Advent. Now, I also want to address with you a concept here, because I know that this is very central in many of our lives, and it's been very important in my life, is the concept of healing. And I want to talk about the close relationship that I see between psychology and sanskaras. And I want to acknowledge a topic that's called healing. And I want to be clear that what I'm about to speak about is my own. It's my own perspective on this. It's my own way of seeing it. But healing or therapy or whatever language you want to use about it is fundamentally about addressing psychological wounds that are carried by us as individuals that can be understood as congealed sanskaric patterns that are experienced as injurious to ourselves. And these patterns are often buried deep in the subconscious, but they manifest themselves in patterns of behavior and thought and experience that can be troubling and also be very resistant to change. And it's therefore the work of healing to tap into this subconscious sufficiently to identify the sources of these difficulties and then reprocess these experiences in a way that the thoughts that emanate from the mental body, that are energized through the subtle body and brought into our awareness through our gross experience, are enabled to be released in the present and freeing ourselves from that particular hold they have on us. And this seems to me to be directly related to what sanskaras are about. And I want to say, Baba didn't address healing directly in the way that it has become so much part of a fabric of our modern age. But in the 1930s, when the development of psychology was really in its infancy, Baba did confirm the ubiquitous nature of these unconsciously driven conflicts. And keep in mind that what I'm about to read was given by Baba in the 30s. He said, the mind rarely functions harmoniously because it is mostly guided and governed by forces in the subconscious, i.e. sanskaras. And few persons take the trouble to attain mastery over these hidden forces that direct the course of mental life. The conflicts which turn upon ordinary things are rarely even brought to the surface of consciousness. Instead, they cast a shadow on one's general feeling about life as if from behind a screen. Such conflicts have to be brought to the surface of consciousness and frankly faced before they can be adequately solved. On such occasion, an attempt should be made to analyze the mental state through deep introspection, for such analysis brings to light the hidden conflicts concerning the matter. Now, Baba then goes on to talk about the state of modern psychology, which was birthed in the 20th century, largely by the work of Sigmund Freud and his followers. And again, remember what I'm about to read was given, I think, in the 30s, maybe the early 40s. Baba said, modern psychology has done much to reveal the sources of conflict, but it has yet to discover methods of awakening inspiration or supplying the mind with something that makes life worth living. This, indeed, is the creative task facing the saviors of humanity. So what does all this have to do with sanskaras? Well, if sanskaras result in congealed tendencies toward thought, feeling, and action, and they're driven by unconscious conflicts, the resolution of these conflicts therefore lead to the dissolution of the energy of these tendencies. Therefore, it would seem that the sanskaras might either be eliminated or reduced in their power as a result of a kind of a healing or therapeutic process. In other words, in our own modern context, healing can perhaps be understood as a core method of unwinding sanskaras. Now, it is in this context that I heard a man named Alan Ewell, some of you may know him, a psychologist who spent a couple of weeks with Baba in the 1950s. I heard him speak at Mehrabad several years ago, and about his experiences in being with Baba, who instructed him as a psychologist that his task was to undertake bringing about what Baba called the, quote, new psychology, which was to bring the spiritual dimension into psychology that directly and presumably to help with the unwinding of sanskaras. And since that time, and again, that was in the 50s, since that time that Baba gave Alain that directive, there has been an explosion of interest in what is termed humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, and other spiritually based approaches to personal development. Presumably, these are approaches that help to address the need for the inspirational element that Baba was referring to when he gave that talk back in the 30s and 40s. Now, there's one final method that Baba addresses for unwinding sanskaras, and I want to spend really pretty much the rest of this talk, the next few minutes on this. And that is, in the final analysis, he indicates that it is actually the most effective and the most fruitful method, which is the high road to God, and which is especially available to sincere seekers during the time of the Avataric Advent, and that is love, which according to Baba, we're still in that period of the Avataric Advent. He said it would last for another 50 years or maybe more than that, but we're still in the very midst of that time. And Baba said this force of love is the most important avenue in leading to the realization of the highest, especially when it's focused on a personality that is the divine, who can be characterized as the divine beloved, or a perfected being, such as the avatar or such as a perfect master. Now, a perfect one is sometimes called a man-god or a god-man. And these are beings who are in states of perfect godhood. They experience infinite consciousness, infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. And they consciously experience the seventh plane of consciousness, but they also, many of them, I don't know about most, retain some link to the creation itself, the universe itself, so that they can assist others in their own efforts to reach the goal. But being perfect, they know everything, including the entire story of each person's journey from the very beginning of their journey as a drop soul, all the way through form, all the way through the human form, up to the point where they are now, and all the way to the point in which they will eventually realize God. They also know these very circumstances that are most ideal for the wearing out and resolution of the aspirant's bindings, sanskaric bindings, and they can simply dissolve all sanskaras that are preventing the individual from knowing their real self. From a very fundamental perspective, then, the primary role of the master can be understood as assisting the disciple in the unwinding of their sanskaras. And because Baba has clarified what is required to form a relationship with such a perfect being. First of all, it's the love that the perfect master awakens in the aspirant. And this love is what attracts and holds the aspirant to the master all the way through the various byways, challenges, difficulties, and impediments that they will ultimately have to face in their journey. And this love is in reality always the reflection in the heart of the disciple of the highest love that is actually they're reflecting the true nature of the master, that actually is their own higher self. Second is obedience, which Baba said is even higher than love. And that is both literal obedience and following the directives that the master gives, but it's also ultimately about the awakening of the intuition and the inner obedience to that intuition, which one becomes to understand and feel as the master's guidance. And finally, there's the surrender to the master, accepting that all that one experiences and undergoes is a direct reflection of the master's compassion and unerring intervention into the life and in the interest of their lover, their disciple. And it's through forming a relationship with such a one that the master will slice through the tightly wound ball of sanskaras that the aspirant has accumulated and end them once and for all. And this can be called their divine intervention. An analogy that Baba gave for all of this, he said, sanskaras can be likened to like a big pile of dried grass, and that all it takes for a perfect master actually is to set a match to that and burn them up in an instant. This work of the master can also be, and I should say that Erich would say that yes, this can be done like that, but that's generally not the way of the master. Generally, the master takes it much more slowly than that, because if he does it too quickly, then that disciple is not available to help in the work of the master. So they will generally do it much more slowly than that, but that is the capability of a master to do that. This work of the master can be quite inscrutable because the master is dealing with his or her infinite knowledge of the intricacies of the disciple's entire range of sanskaras. So a master can actually take a very ruthless approach to trying to help wear out and unwind these sanskaras. But Baba also said that the way of the master is generally sweet. It's generally agreeable to the disciple. As Baba once said to Darwin Shaw, who was one of his very close Western followers, he said, "I am your master, but I am also your friend." So Baba once described this in a very pointed way to differentiate what it means to work with a master to resolve one's sanskaras as composed to a more conventional view of what constitutes the spiritual life. And I think this is really, really interesting. This is from Baba. He says, "With me, no one can live what the world considers a moral life. Here, meaning here, around me, we are concerned with spirituality, not morals. A spiritual life is not ruled nor bound by any principles. The sanskaras of each one are different, and so the behavior and temperament of each one are different. In a virtuous life, evil is suppressed and good surfaces, but the evil is still there. The bad sanskaras remain and have to be worked out, if not in this life, then in the next one, and the next or the one after. In the spiritual life, both good and bad sanskaras express themselves and both get nullified. A spiritual life leads one toward naturalness, whereas a virtuous life in the guise of humility inflates the ego and perpetuates it. And I remember Bal Kalchuri, another one of Baba's close mandali, he used to say, we don't live here the ideal life. We live the spiritual life here. That was a distinction that Bal would often make. But the one caveat about this, of course, is that one has to be dealing with one who is actually a perfected master. And Baba's made it abundantly clear that a true master, and he was clear that there are many who profess to be masters who in fact have not actually achieved that status. But a true perfected master is 100% pure. And he said that, and they are 100% in service of those who have surrendered to them. So without a single drop of self-interest in such a one. Now, I left this off. A spiritual life, though, is only led under the guidance and orders of the avatar perfect master who knows the pulse of everyone and treats everyone according to his particular malady. A really important point. One of the most important Sufi poets was a man named Hafez, who Baba said was perfect and was Baba's favorite poet. And one of the most important set of couplets that we know of from Hafez that Baba loved, and which I think highlights the essential orientation about surrendering to such a master, was this one. It says, befitting a fortunate slave, carry out every command of the master, without any question of why or what. About what you hear from the master, never say it is wrong, because, my dear, the fault lies in your own incapacity to understand him. I am slave of the master who has released me from ignorance. Whatever my master does is of the highest benefit to all concerned. In the very final hours of Baba's physical life, and he was in great suffering, he was in great pain, his body was being racked by very intense spasms, and he called for a board containing these couplets to be brought to his room. In fact, this is the very board. Those of you who have been to India and have been to Baba's cabin next to his samadhi, that's where this is located. And many of the Mandali believe that in doing that they take this as Baba's final message in the body to his lovers. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about karma, sanskaras, the ego, winding, unwinding, psychology, healing, ways of unwinding, the role of the master, what's involved in following a master, and all of it is very, very fundamental in my view to really and very practical and very central to how I orient myself and following Baba. I want to end with some words from Baba that put into perspective the importance of this very topic we've been dealing with here. Baba says, the eternal bliss, the infinite power, the unfading glory, and the absolute truth of God realization are not to be had for nothing. The individualized soul has to go through all the travail, the pain, and the struggle of evolution, reincarnation, and involution before it can inherit this treasure which is hidden at the heart of creation. The price it has to pay for coming into possession of this treasure is its own existence as a separate ego. The limited individuality must disappear entirely if there is to be an entrance into the unlimited state of Godhood. Let's end, please, with a moment of silence. Jai Baba.